Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this evening. I kind of just threw this thing together because I had been on Twitter, and obviously the events in Canada have left a lot of people wondering what is going on. A lot of people saying, they can't do this. That's illegal. What does this mean? And so we've seen a lot of Carl Schmitt posting lately, with a good reason. That we're certainly literally talking about a state of exception here, and so. What I wanted to do, because I asked on Twitter, would people rather me do a Twitter space or a YouTube stream, and the response was overwhelmingly do a YouTube stream. So just going to kind of be working off the seat of my pants here. So it's not going to be as prepared as maybe some of my other stuff. If you want to kind of get more prepared remarks and kind of a edited video, I did two edited videos on Carl Schmitt. So you can check those out on the channel if you haven't before. So, but we're just going to be linking kind of the things that Carl Schmitt talked about with some of the current events, especially here with Canada. So today I have with me the Prudentialist. Thank you so much, sir, for joining me.
Well, thank you for the invite.
Yeah, he was kind enough to jump on with like an hour's notice. But I know that the Prudentialist is also familiar with a decent amount of Schmidt's work, and I wanted to make sure I had somebody with me to keep me, on the straight and narrow here, so I don't just ramble endlessly by myself. But we're going to be looking at two main things. We're going to be looking at two of Carl Schmitt's essays. One is going to be the concept of the political, and the other one is going to be political theology. Because we're going to get into the Canada stuff and talking about the state of exception, but I want to lead in with some clarification about the friend enemy distinction. Because you see this a lot. People throw around the friend enemy distinction. This is friend enemy politics. The memes are everywhere, and that's certainly partially my fault with the memes. So my memes are to blame as well. But while the memes tell you, kind of friend good, enemy bad, and it's not that that's not part of the friend enemy distinction, but there's a lot more to it. And of course, it's a meme, so it boils it down to its essence. But I feel that kind of robs it of some of the context that is really important, because you don't really need a genius to tell you friend good, enemy bad, right? Like there's nothing particularly profound about that, except that it kind of cuts through all the BS. But I wanted to go ahead and explain a little bit of the stuff around it, the theory around it, so that it makes more sense in in that context with the concept of the political. And I see Skeptical Waves here, and yes, Skeptical Waves has a couple different things from Schmitt. I think he's got one of the essays and something else from Schmitt up, and I think more is coming. So if you have not checked out Skeptical Waves channel, that's an invaluable resource to get kind of audiobooks of things that you otherwise cannot get audiobooks of. So make sure to check that out. And I forgot to tweet out that we are starting. So let me just retweet that real quick, and then we will kick off.
But yes, do subscribe to Skeptical Waves. I was doing my cross-county drive for work on Monday, and I was actually listening to Carl Schmitt's Political Theology on Skeptical Waves' channel. So I'm extra prepared for today's impromptu discussion, thanks to Mr. Waves.
Yes, absolutely. No, there's no excuse to not be getting free obscure books on audiobook from Mr. Waves there. And also, of course, make sure to check out the Prudentialist channel. I'm sure at this point most of you are familiar, but in case you haven't subscribed to his channel or gone to his Twitter, make sure to check out all his stuff as well. So let's go ahead and get started. This isn't going to be a long one. Like I said, this is really just an impromptu stream, but let's go ahead and begin with the friend-enemy distinction. So the friend-enemy distinction, for those who are unfamiliar, comes from one of the quotes in Carl Schmitt's essay, The Concept of the Political. And the quote is this. He says, "The specific political distinction to which or to which political actions and motives can be reduced is between friend and enemy. And so, that's the one that gets posted a lot. That's what people see, and that explains a good bit. It is a good bit of something to understand. But I want to go ahead and give you some context about the concept of the political and what Schmitt means by the kind of that friend enemy distinction. So Carl Schmitt says that basically, in order to have a law, right, in order to apply law, to have rule of law, we need to have basically a population that shares some kind of identity. We need to have a feature, and it can really be a lot of different things, but we need to have something that binds us together. We need to have kind of a foundational identity that we all agree upon and we all understand and is taken kind of for granted, so that then we can all assume that we will operate under kind of the auspices of law. And so he says that when we're looking at the idea of the political is not some kind of like separate thing. For a lot of us, we think like, okay, well, there's your family, and there's religion, and there's your business, and then there's politics. And politics is this like separate sphere, right? This separate realm. But what Schmitt says is actually politics is kind of a state that anything can enter, anything can become political. And what makes something political is when there's whatever it is, there's a distinction generated that is identitarian, that creates a friend group and an enemy group, an in group and an out group, if you will. But his terminology is friend and enemy. And he says that whatever it is, whether it be your religion or the rule of your country, or your bowling league, once something has become core to an identity, and that is what forms kind of the basis of the identity of the group. And once it identifies itself as friend and another group as enemy, that is going to expand in many different ways. That's going to come to define the group and the process and everything kind of in the society or in whatever that group is touching. And it's going to expand outward, and it's going to consume more and more. And basically, the political question will continue to expand and become more and more important until it is resolved. And so if you're looking at like, the example of the bowling group, if you have one group that thinks that your bowling league is supposed to be for drinking beer and hanging out, and another group who thinks it's for like spreading some kind of cause, then you're going to have two groups that see each other as kind of enemies, right? It's going to politicize your group. It's going to bifurcate your group, and you're going to see your part of the bowling group as friend and their part as enemy. And as you do everything in that group, the friend enemy distinction is going to come to define like everything that group does. So like when you have a fundraiser, the things that you fundraise for, will be separated by friend and enemy. And when you decide teams, that you're going to line up with your friends, the people you identify with against those that are enemy, and it's going to seep into like every aspect of the bowling group until it completely dominates, and it will continue to work its way through, it kind of burn through until eventually one group defeats the other, and you end up with this kind of return to a homogenized group with one identity again. And so he says, this is very common, right? We don't think of this as people who grew up in liberal, like multicultural, type societies. We don't think of this as very common, but he says actually this conflict is very common. It happens all the time, and groups consistently run into other groups that threaten their identity, right? And they create this friend-enemy distinction. And because that happens regularly, we need to understand that if you're in a political situation, if you're in a situation where you have two groups that are competing for control of whatever it is, that distinction, that friend enemy distinction, is going to come to define every action. And of course, we can see that in our culture, right? It was very obvious in some things, but now it's spread out into all kinds of stuff. Music, movies, comic books, famously, video games with like Gamergate. The friend enemy distinction, that political aspect, has leaked into pretty much every single thing in our society, to where, like, at this point, even sports, right, like kind of the last domain where everyone in the culture could come together, has been kind of infected by this friend enemy distinction. There's no escaping it, because we can kind of see that we like threaten each other's understanding of identity. And so when he talks about, those actions being reducible to the distinction between friend and enemy, he's talking about how, that understanding of politics expands to kind of consume every part and every aspect of the group until that issue is resolved. And he says that one of the things that liberalism does, one of his problems with liberalism, is liberalism kind of worked to obfuscate this, right? Liberalism worked to say, well, we're gonna take all of those existential differences, all those things that we disagree about, whose God is real, what truly makes things right and wrong, and we're gonna like kind of just reduce things to like the minimum operable morality, and we're gonna try to run society on just kind of this minimum operable morality, and that way we don't have to fight about the friend enemy distinction. We're going to kind of basically get rid of the political. We're going to get rid of the friend enemy distinction. We're going to get rid of this like existential crisis between groups, and we're going to allow them to function together, because we'll have kind of this objective system of liberalism that runs everything, and that'll be enough to kind of get us by. But what happens, of course, and this is what he says, this is the problem with liberalism, is that it really just it doesn't actually get rid of the friend enemy distinction. You can't actually get rid of the friend enemy distinction. What it does is it simply allows it to run in the background. It allows it to run kind of hidden from view. And the reason that it's so effective for certain groups is it allows the friend enemy distinction to operate without the average person seeing it. And so that average person thinks they're making compromises. They think they are kind of working their way towards some kind of more cohesive community. But what they're really doing is they're being convinced to kind of give up the things that are actually existentially important to their group identity to other groups without realizing it. They're making sacrifices that are core to their identity group, their friend enemy distinction, while other people who are actually operating the system are not making that sacrifice. And so he kind of has a problem with it, because it's kind of dishonest, and it tricks people into thinking that, and it's only a matter of time before that kind of breaks down and the actual friend enemy kind of shines through. And I think that's a lot of what people recognize today, right? Is we've kind of got a certain number of groups, in America, who kind of feel their backs up against the wall. That's what you see with like the CRT type pushback, right? Is people who have been told that, well, if you just make this one little sacrifice or this other little sacrifice, eventually everyone will be cool and everything will be copacetic, and we can just kind of all move on together without without threatening each other's, existential understanding, or without threatening each other's understanding of our identity groups. But that never comes, right? And eventually you just realize that you've kind of given up a massive amount of territory without ever achieving kind of this utopia that liberalism promised you. But now that I've ranted a lot, Prudentialist, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of your understanding of the friend enemy distinction and kind of how it operates today?
Sure. So while it definitely covered probably the very thorough way of understanding it, the thing to also keep in mind, right, is that this is done with a significant amount of importance and emphasis on this being existential. And how Auron was talking about it, with it being, the aspect of liberalism, we can't escape this form of, dealing with the friend enemy distinction, or dealing with what's considered to be existential. That's kind of why we see in a lot of aspects of liberal democracy, especially if you live in the United States, every election is the election of your lifetime. Every election is do or die. This is why a lot of our aspects of politics, in order to get people into their attention, is to rally around those that would oppose these existential threats. So while recently now what we're seeing in Canada, of course, is the protests either in Ottawa throughout various ports and bridges, with the truckers taking their stand against these mandates. This is why they're seeing this to be considered an existential threat to goods and services, a threat to having their government function, calling it to be under occupation, labeling them with a specific language to make them that existential threat, to make sure that democracy can continue to function and that people who wish to protest peacefully, as the Prime Minister has said, will do it. And that kind of gives you a really important thing here, like Auron had said, because you can't escape the friend-enemy distinction because people inevitably collectivize. And in fact, even other philosophers and other writers had commented this on as well. I mean, Leo Strauss had wrote that, because man is, he said, because man is evil by nature, he needs dominion, but dominion can be established by men unified or unified against other men. And so when we identify people that think differently than us, we identify those that disagree with our positions, it becomes very easy to take it to the logical conclusion that we're, if at the end, down the line somewhere, we're going to have these fundamental problems that are going to define my worldview or my identity. And that's why it's important for us to have dominion over those people. One of the things that you'll hear a lot is that democracy is meant to sort of suppress that urge to have dominion over others and to sort of have compromise and to work it out and to create these broad coalitions to prevent it. But at the end of the day, even in our American electoral system, our politics are always existential, whether it's over climate change, whether it's over criminal justice reform. And now you're kind of finally seeing the right kind of strike back, so to speak, whether it's the pushback against CRT or now with the mandates and what the truckers are doing.
Yeah, and Schmitt always has a weird kind of relationship with democracy, not just because he's a mid-century German, but also because he kind of acknowledges that in his time and his place, democracy has gained so much clout that it's kind of the only legitimating thing in the popular mind. But he seems to see a lot of the problems with democracy, including, he says things like you really need kind of this homogenous identity in order to operate it. But at the same time, he seems to see like the kind of the serious problems in that you kind of see that these things are always going to it's always going to operate to divide people, right? As Nick Land said, wherever there's disagreement, there's an opportunity to rule, right? And so you're always going to end up with these kind of sectarian conflicts in democracy because there's power up for grabs. And so there's actually an incentive to bifurcate your identity in a democracy because it can generate power. And so what you really get rewarded for is finding kind of key people and rewarding them and using them as a wedge against kind of the general populace, as opposed to like ruling for the good of the people. And that's a consistent problem that like I said, Schmitt kind of moves back and forth between how he understands his relationship with democracy and the friend enemy distinction. But the key thing is understanding, I think, that that it is, yes, in some ways friend good, enemy bad, but it's really more of an understanding of the mechanics of power and understanding the mechanics of the kind of of political identity and how that works and how that comes to impact everything in your society, your culture, all your institutions. The reason we're seeing everything weaponized, right? The reason that you see the you see that everything from again, sports, music, video games, everything has to become political, is because basically we're just racing to capture every piece of ground we can in this kind of conflict of identity. And as the Prudentialist pointed out, you both of these groups see themselves at this point as an existential threat to each other, because the truckers have been backed up so far. They gave up as much ground as they could, but they're at the point where if they give in this last bit, basically they won't have jobs. They won't be able to put food on the table. And of course, Trudeau is in a situation where he already looks weak, and he knows that if he loses that, at the end of the day, every regime is at a point where if it tells the citizens what to do and the citizens say no, now what? Like you're now in an existential crisis, right? Like, because if you don't find a way to assert your authority, then they know that basically you're dead in the water. And so that's why these groups are kind of behaving how they are.
Yeah, and another good way to sort of complement the understanding of the friend-enemy distinction is to give yourself a sort of a very firm grasp of selectorate theory. I mean, just to break it down from like De Mesquita in the Dictator's Handbook is that you need to have small winning coalitions. I mean, the fewer people to satisfy it can remain in control. And by remaining in control or maintaining that, you have revenue flows to distribute to your friends, pay your friends well enough so they don't consider overthrowing you, and don't take your friends' money and redistribute it to the masses. Those are just some parts of it to maintain power. And you can kind of see how that works with the distribution of power and influences revenue with, say, Trudeau and the sort of the media establishment that's rallied against them by labeling these people as existential. You're keeping your media base happy. You can rally up and, sustain that idea of consent, that you're in control, because Trudeau does need to look legitimate here, considering in the last election, he did not do very well. He maintains a minority government. And now he's screaming out saying, these people are a threat to their democracy. They're waving these flags, of course, of mid-century German flags that look like they were freshly bought from Amazon to make the regular protesters look bad. And now they're seizing of the assets and trying to have them redistributed, as GoFundMe had talked about, to legitimate charitable organizations. And so they're trying to make sure that their political friends are being rewarded because their small group of friends, whether it's the media, whether it's their small urban voting bases, it ensures that Trudeau has the necessary coalition to maintain his power and exert his authority over those that have nowhere else to go because they're now at their existential limit. And these truckers are now protesting, and he's got to respond back.
Yeah, and this is the thing, right? This is the problem I think that we have because we've been steeped in this liberalism is we have a lot of problem with like the mechanics of politics, right? We have a hard time being honest about what politics is. And politics is about rewarding your friends and punishing your enemies. And that's why you want as much as possible you friends to be people who benefit from your population doing well, right? If you want your rulers to rule to the benefit of the masses, what you want is the good of the rulers to coincide with the good of the masses. And it's never going to be perfect, right? These people are always going to rule to some level in their self-interest. But there's this great line, and I wish I could quote it verbatim, but there's this great line in Bertrand de Juvenel's book on power, and he says like basically every king starts out as a warlord and a bandit, and eventually over time they realize that they make more money by making their people more prosperous and more happy than they do by just crushing every red cent out of them. And once they realize that their interests align with the interest of the people, and ultimately like their stewardship of the people will benefit them and their son and their son and generations to follow, that's when the Rex is born. That's when the spirit of the king is born, because that's when your politicians are now they are still working with self-interest, but their interests are aligned well enough with the people to benefit them. And that's why you don't want friend enemy distinctions as much as possible running down the center of your nation or your country or your kingdom or whatever. Because when you're making friends and enemies of populations, then you will always be governing to the detriment of people who are like intrinsically part of your rule, and that is not good in the long term. That's always going to create a backlash. That's always going to make a certain population governable and resentful, and it's always going to put you in a situation where you are in trouble. So as much as possible you want the kind of the sovereign and those keys, those political friends, to be aligned with the good of the people as much as possible. Again, they will always benefit more. You will always see the elite ruling class benefit more, but denying that elite ruling class exists and denying that friend enemy distinctions exist is even worse, because then we create this kind of veil where everything has to operate behind, and we don't really understand what's going on. People yell out things like, "Oh, why are they operating this way? Why can people burn down churches in Canada over some lie about bodies being buried in mass graves?" and nothing happens. In fact, the prime minister basically cheers them on. But as soon as a peaceful protest happens, these people are getting special powers, being called out against them. They're having their money seized. They're invoking like martial law, basically. Why is this? Why are they allowed to do this unbalanced thing? And by not understanding how politics actually functions and how power actually functions, we actually harm people rather than help them. That fiction is not useful in the long run.
Yeah, and the fact is that we can, going back to the point about how this is existential, Schmitt talks a lot about how this is based sort of in theological grounds, that we, in a nominal Christian tradition, it is the idea of good and evil, it is the Christ and the Antichrist. And in terms of the state, there is sort of that idea that the friend-enemy distinction is based down on sort of a political theology or a political formula, if you will, on how people operate based on faith, of how the state operates, on how they expect their democracy to operate, how they expect like-minded voters to do so. And again, that's sort of why we're seeing in democratic systems, especially both now in the US, but now more recently in Canada, is that you're taking a look at this is seen as like an eschatological problem, that this could be the end. This could be the end times for their world and how they see it. This is the evil that has finally come up to them. And because it is so easy now with media and those that are within your inner cadre and circle to demonize others, or even have people to make it look like that they're evil, whether it's those freshly unfurled mid-century German flags, or just saying that there are a couple of people saying racist slurs in Ottawa, that it becomes very easy to rally the masses against you and make them realize that their political way of life, their faith, their beliefs are all at risk, and things could really come down to the end here. So it's why we need to take action. That's why you can manufacture consent for these actions to take place, which is basically the culmination of, pandemic emergency powers and the post 9/11 security state within the Anglosphere.
All right, so now that you've mentioned kind of political theology, I think now is a good time to move to kind of our second part of this. I just wanted to clear up, like I said, the friend-enemy distinction and kind of expand on it, because I think people kind of have a basic knowledge, but I wanted to give them a more holistic understanding of kind of where that comes from. And so the second part is going to be more applicable to what's going on in Canada, I think, which is Carl Schmitt's other essay we're going to talk about, which is political theology. And political theology contains another famous Carl Schmitt quote, which is, "The sovereign is he who decides on the exception." And so, as the Prudentialist had been mentioning, Carl Schmitt basically thinks that all politics is basically secularized theology. In fact, in many ways, if you want to get kind of a more holistic understanding of Carl Schmitt, he's taking a lot of Joseph de Maistre, who I'm a big fan of. He takes a lot of Joseph de Maistre and kind of distills it down into its essence and secularizes it. I'm not as big a fan of the secularization, but Carl Schmitt is very good at turning like Joseph de Maistre into like extremely quotable nuggets. And so in political theology, he says basically all the concepts that we have in politics is just secularized theology. And he says that, in especially kind of with the American tradition, we're very much not fans of the idea of a sovereign who can violate the Constitution and violate their law. Like, we like the idea that our Constitution is finely crafted and finely honed and prepared to deal with anything. There's this great resilient system based on the ideas of the Enlightenment, and it's prepared for any situation. And so we can operate under the rule of law. We don't have to have the rule of kings. We don't have to worry about the sovereign, because the people are sovereign and they put this Constitution into place. And so we all operate under this rule of law established by this well-built Constitution. And he says this basically comes from kind of the deist understanding of theology, right? Like, at this time, you have a lot of deists in the American founding, and they did not like the kind of the miracles part of theology. They didn't like the miracles in the Bible, and so they wanted to strip them out. And he said basically the sovereign stepping in and acting is basically like the secular version of God stepping in and creating miracles. It violates the law, so we don't like it. And that kind of carried into the political constitution makeup of America, and others who then based their kind of understanding of liberal democracy on America. And so we like to think that we're just going to continually be ruled by this constitution. But he says the problem is really simple. No one can predict everything, right? Like at some point, every constitution hits a wall, because no matter how brilliant you are, no matter how well you think into the future, no matter how well you understand human nature, at the end of the day, something is going to happen that is outside the limits of the Constitution to handle. And when you reach that point, when you reach that thing that is outside the limits, you've reached the exception, right? And once you create the exception, once you've reached the exception and you're no longer operating under the rule of law, you're no longer operating under the official dictates of the Constitution, then you're in the state of exception. And someone has to decide when you move from the rule of law, the rule of the Constitution, into the state of the exception where those things no longer apply. And the person who decides when the exception gets invoked, that is your sovereign. If you want to know who the sovereign is, look for the person who is able to create the exception, the person who's able to put you into the state of exception. Prudentialist, did you want to say a little bit about that?
Sure. Like you had mentioned, in political theology, Schmitt is sort of examining the Weimar Constitution as well as what had been constructed from the Constitution, right, fresh after the war, right? And he's sort of examining when the president can make those like state of exceptions in emergencies, and why it's important to study the exception rather than just what is the nominal rule of law. Because if you can understand where those exceptions can be made, then you can really have a firmer understanding of where power comes from. And this is built off of one of his earlier essays, which is on dictatorships. So he's sort of trying to give you a better explanation for how authoritarian regimes or a dictator can essentially rule, because we should be studying exceptions, because that is where power is truly generated. And as Schmitt writes, and I'll just take it off from the chapter Definitions of Sovereignty, he writes, what characterizes an exception is principally unlimited authority, which means the suspension of the entire existing order. In such a situation, it is clear the state remains, whereas law recedes. Because the exception is different from anarchy and chaos, order in the juristic sense still prevails, even if it is not the ordinary kind. And I think that little section there is just as important as the sovereign is he who decides the exception, because while the idea of law and order, such as, seizing bank accounts or cryptocurrency, just without due process or any sort of real legal system, it's meant to, in the position of the sovereign, to maintain order. So the laws are not necessarily what matters here. It's the idea that you can enforce the power, suspend what is, the status quo ante about law and order, and make sure that your concept of the state as the sovereign still remains. So in the position of, say, Prime Minister Trudeau, in order to preserve his power, in order to preserve his idea of the state, so the state can still remain, the juristic sense of law, is kicked out, and we're doing things now without the traditional liberal principle of due process.
Yes, and in that essay, I believe he also makes the distinction between a dictator in like the Roman sense of someone who temporarily takes power through a constitutional process that is acknowledged to take the exception, and then just like a tyrant, right? Someone who is just coming in and breaching it through kind of sheer force of will. And he says that's about as much as any constitution can do, right? Is explain who has the authority to declare the exception, but that's the only way that you can basically keep it within the context of that constitution. And that can be valuable in holding the system together, because it defines a certain time in which, obviously, like with the Roman dictator, after 6 months, you're supposed to return the power back to your consuls. And so it can have that effect where at least you can still return back to kind of the state of rule of law after the exception. But he does make a differentiation between kind of those two. Now, interestingly, Sean Weiland here has a comment that I think is valuable. He says, Constitution's laws are always post hoc descriptions of what has already been decided. It's never the basis for doing anything. Law is discovered, not created. And there's a lot of truth to that. In fact, that's what de Maistre basically says when de Maistre is talking about law and constitutions. He says that basically that constitutions are only the solidification of, kind of the formalization of a culture and institutions that already exist. He says that no constitution can create a country, create a body of law, or create a central institution. All it does is formalize those that are already operating kind of in your society. And so again, it's very much the counter of our understanding of power and law. We think we're like, okay, the law has given these powers to people. They look at the laws that guides them on what their powers are. But in most situations, the law is basically simply formalizing powers that already been manifest kind of in the society. It's de Maistre was of course Catholic and very much so, and so his understanding of where laws and constitutions and countries came from and sovereigns in general was from God. And he said, basically no man ever makes that. You can't create your own character, you can't create your own nature, you're formed by those things. And so you don't shape your country shapes you. You don't shape your tradition shapes you. And so when God, kind of basically wills someone into power and the people follow kind of those tenets and those traditions and those folkways, that's what gets solidified into then political doctrine, not the other way around.
Yeah, and I mean, because this is built this was published prior to the concept of the political, you can kind of see where the friend enemy distinction comes from, because it's viewed through a theological lens, that good and evil, Christ and antichrist sort of comparison that Schmitt makes. Because the sovereign views things in a deistic sense, Schmitt writes that the exception, taking, deviating from the law, letting it receive, exerting power to preserve the state, these are viewed as sort of the secular form of what is considered to be a miracle. And if you can perform these miracles and then you are sort of seen as God, you have the ability to maintain control over the state. And you are, as Schmitt writes, you are like the sort of Hobbesian definition of the Leviathan. And in doing so, you're more able to maintain power over these guidelines, over this sort of constitutional doctrine, which is sort of your secular deistic view of natural law, of religious law and religious texts, which gives you, of course, that advantage to continue to rule over the state in this sort of theological sense. Because it reminds me a lot of what like G.K. Chesterton wrote. Like, once man abolishes God, government becomes the God. And this was before, I think, Chesterton had wrote that, but Schmitt's talking about it right here, just explaining that here we are.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that's why so many people get confused about obviously what's going on in Canada. And I think most people watching this are aware that, kind of like the base understanding of democracy and rule of law are not what they seem. For most of you, this is probably not your first time interacting with that concept. But as we see so many kind of people in the mainstream suddenly say, oh, so you mean the elected leader of a democracy can just out of nowhere, you know, change the rules about everything? He can, without any kind of real logic behind it, other than I like these people and I don't like these people. He can declare some group terrorists and seize their assets and unleash, special, police units or military or anything on them. He can invoke certain powers out of nowhere in very disproportionate manner towards these people. I thought all this stuff was supposed to be restricted. I thought we had these constitutions, or in Canada it's called the Charter, right? They have the Charter instead, I think is the document that's supposed to enshrine some of those freedoms. But the people who have grown up on this story that basically like the Constitution itself and its tenets will protect them from the ability of their leaders to kind of exercise that power, and that democracy will ultimately hold all of that in check, are getting a rude awakening to how like power actually operates, how politics actually operates. When people are really backed up into a wall, when especially a weak leader like Trudeau sees kind of the writing on the wall, realizes he's lost in many ways the popular mandate, and really has to hold his power together with very strained ability, then they're going to dig into kind of this exception. They're going to go in there, and especially guys like Trudeau, these are foxes, not lions. These are people who came to power through their ability to manipulate and their ability to kind of perform, and did not come to power because they're like competent with ruling through kind of force or use of power. And so when their power is challenged, when kind of the illusion crumbles, we see them overreact, right? A competent leader would have never been in this position. They would have been understanding kind of where they were. They would have made cut deals. They would have been working in the background, or if they were going to respond, it would have been in a particularly concise way. But instead, we see guys like Trudeau flailing around and they're just grabbing at these kind of powers, invoking exceptions without thinking about the consequences. Because really he doesn't know how to solve this problem, and he doesn't know how to exercise his power in a way that will bring things back under control, because in many ways his society doesn't allow him to, right? He doesn't have that uniformity that is required to kind of rule with that authority. And I think this is a problem that we're going to see over and over again in the West, right? We saw things kind of like this in Australia bubbling up, but they never got quite to this level. There was a trucker strike in Australia. There was some pushback, some street protests that the media kind of glossed over, but things never quite got to this part. And also, to be fair, Australia's on the other side of the world. It's isolated from a lot of the other kind of first world Anglo nations. And so people tended not to focus as much on what was happening there. But Canada's right next door to America. And that means that everyone is taking notice. Everyone is thinking, okay, well, what if that happened here? Because it's not really hard to see Joe Biden or his lackeys being in exactly this position. And you can be sure they're taking notes.
Yeah, and the reason why I think that it's important for us to sort of clear out the air with Schmitt as well is because it gives you a firmer understanding of how the power operates and how the people in charge, the elites, can accomplish things. And I mean, for Schmitt, his focus on the exception is, he puts it sort of here translated. It says, the exception is more interesting than the rule. The rule proves nothing. The exception proves everything. It confirms not only the rule, but also its existence, which derives only from the exception. In the exception, the power of real life breaks through the crust of the mechanism that has become torpid by repetition. And Schmitt is explaining that, it's times of the exception wherein the law, which we always consider mundane, we are like, there's one comedian that tells you like the Constitution is the one legal document that makes more sense the drunker you get. And it's because, it's been torpid by repetition. We talk about it all the time. We talk about these rights and these freedoms, but we don't talk about the power that allows it to exist. And the sovereign, of course, is the one that, allows for and proves that exception. This is where those powers come into existence. And so if you can pretty much say that the rest of due process and that the law doesn't matter, and for the existence of my power, my friends, and the state, responding to being, attacked or put into an existential position, which Trudeau is claiming that he is, then we have to, suspend things in order to put back law and order, merely emphasizing the fact that you can't get away from the theological. We have it inside of our own form of secular liberal democracy. That's why you'll see Auron or myself compare these things to sort of religious difference, or what we call the state religion, because these things are viewed in theological terms of what is good, what is evil, what are the threats to what we consider to be the good way, the path, the good book, so to speak. And if you're not adhering to all of the right sacraments and all of the right prostrations and confessions over the state religion, which here in the U.S. it's sort of the Civil Rights Act, and in Canada it's its own form of wokeness in its own right, with the First Nations and burning down churches and things like that. Then yeah, the importance of ensuring that there's an exception to the rule allows that power to be created. And if you can come up with ways to create enemies or to create people that can be labeled as such, differences of opinion, like Auron mentioned with Nick Land, that creates power and it allows you to take advantage of the situation.
Yeah, and Zero HP Lovecraft just had a great thing he was talking about on Twitter that kind of addresses that what you were just saying as well, Prudentialist. He said, someone was complaining like, how can anyone support Canada basically seizing this money and making these rules? It basically makes protests illegal, and how can you ever think that that's going to be okay? That people can just be punished for their beliefs, and other protests can be allowed to function, unharassed. How can you think that having that disparity will be okay? And Zero HP said basically, it's not just that those protests will be allowed to function. It's basically, if you don't see a protest quashed in this way, if you don't see the state step in and use the state of exception and seize this money and deploy troops or police or whatever in this way, then basically what is that protest is state sanctioned, right? This basically creates what is tantamount to a state sanctioned protest, because if the state's willing to go out and crush protests this way, and they're willing to go to the wall and just destroy people's lives to stop protests, and then you see them not do that on certain protests, that basically that protest is state sanctioned. And of course, we know that relates to things like BLM and other protest toppling statues and that kind of thing. And so not only then do we know that these protests are state sanctioned, basically these protests become rituals, right? We know that the state encourages them, allows them, does not respond to them the way that it responds to protests that it actually hates. And so in some ways, these protests become like performative, offerings to the state, where, okay, we will allow you to go out and express your freedom in this particular way. And it's the only way you're allowed to express it, which is basically you acknowledging your commitment to kind of our religion, to our belief system, to our political theology, because you will allow you to worship publicly in this manner, but not the enemy. They're not allowed to worship publicly in their manner. They're not allowed to protest. You are. And so I think that that's very interesting, that basically by punishing protests in one way, by taking the enemy's protests and crushing them in a particular manner, you set up a pattern that makes it clear when a protest is allowable and basically endorsed by the state. And it becomes basically like a public celebration then of the values of the state and the theology of the state.
Not to mention, the nice thing that kind of comes out of this, if there's some sort of macabre silver lining, is that not only are you finding out what's state sanctioned, but you're kind of seeing the formalization of this power structure also come before us, something that has been talked about by some neo-reactionary writers like Mencius Moldbug, asking for more formalization of power so it can be identified. So you can have a better understanding of how the regime operates. And because you're creating this, conflict between people, because we can't escape the liberal, aspects of democracy, because democracy wants to have sort of a simulacra of a civil war, a non-violent civil war where we come together, we go to the ballot box, and we determine how things operate and compromise. We can't escape the fact that we still have what are, to many of us, existential disagreements. We're now at an all-time high, both in Canada and the United States. We look at people of differing political opinions and we're just like, we can't live with these guys. That's why you're getting the conversations about national divorces happening a lot here in the States as well. And then for Canada, right, this is now with the invoking of basically wartime powers. It sort of reminds me of what like Randolph Bourne had said, that war is the health of the state. Because by creating and abrogating authority during these conflicts, it only sustains more power. And as we can tell with these protests, if you're of a certain political opinion, the state is at war with you. whether it's seizing of money or if you want to protest what you thought was not the most transparent election ever, then, you're going to find yourself pretty much either in a prison, you're going to find yourself having your license taken away to take on your truck or your tractor, and your money seized without due process. This is where you're at, because if not, more money will be stolen, more people will be put in jail, and it will seem more and more symbolic and performative rather than accomplishing anything, because these powers have been invoked. They will continue to try their best to arrest people and create more instances of conflict. There are people saying that, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had found all kinds of firearms from these truckers that are trying to, stage some sort of violent action, even though because of Canadian gun laws, they can't actually get a hold of those firearms in the first place. It all just seems convenient. So that's exactly what we're seeing here, is that they're arrogating more authority, more power, and they're trying to crack down on an enemy that they think is existential. And our politics being as polarized as they have become, I do fear that we will see only more and more of this in the near future.
Yeah, and you can really tell from the way that they have approached the truckers, right? Because they're not giving them any outs, right? They it's weird. You would think that they would try to like leave some kind of resolution there, but really the Trudeau government has been very clear. Like, there's basically no way for you to back down from this, because if you do, we're planning to crush you in every way possible, right? Like, basically, we're going to make it so you can't, you can't operate your business, you can't put food on the table. And so if you basically come, bend the knee to us, we're going to crush you. And they're just declaring that outright. They're not really leaving a back door. And so, like the Prudentialist says, that just really even more kind of polarizes and solidifies things. There's not allowed to be a negotiation. There's not allowed to be a way out. There's not a way to come to an amicable understanding, or even one where you can kind of bend the knee, but at least go back to the life you had before. No, enemies will be punished. They will be crushed. They'll be driven before you. You'll hear the lamentations of their women. That's really been kind of the language that's come out of the Trudeau government when it comes to the truckers and their options. And so, like the Prudentialist says, that only really brings things to a head far more sharply and really unfortunately. But that said, I think we've covered a lot of this, and I didn't want to make this too long. So I see at least one question here. So we'll run down any super chat questions we have. If you want to get those in, you can go ahead and get them in now before we wrap up. But let me go ahead and grab this one here from Felix Fairmont for $5. Thank you very much for your support. He says, is the exception to determine when to become the exception a meta-sovereign, or is it that sovereignty to give others that power? I don't quite understand that question. So to rehash that a little bit, basically the state of exception is when you are moving beyond the rule of law, where the dictates of the Constitution are no longer going to apply, right? And like we said, every Constitution reaches its limits. You can never predict everything. So at some point, you're going to enter a state where the rules and the dictates of the Constitution can no longer be successfully applied to your situation. And if you want to know who the sovereign is, if you want to know who has that total power, then it's going to be the person or the body or whatever that can make that decision as to when you move into the exception. Because as a number of different people have said, sovereignty is never destroyed. You never get rid of sovereignty. It's always conserved. You might spread it out among a group of people, but collectively they will still operate with the power of the sovereign. And so if you want to understand when where that power resides, it's the person or group of people or organization or whatever that is able to invoke that state of exception, where to decide when you move from constitutional rule of law into rule by whoever. It might not necessarily be the body that puts you into the state of exception, though it usually is, but it could be putting that power in the hands of someone else. But
I noticed in chat he said that apparently the theological aspects of answered what he was looking for.
okay.
but again, it is an eschatological thing. Even though it's secular, even though it's deist, it still takes the framework of these religious concepts, and that's why we have these eschatologies. And if we view it as existential, we view it as the end times, whether it's over climate, whether it's over our sacred democracy, whether it's over, being able to, not go to your Tim Hortons and get your cup of coffee because the truckers are honking and that makes you upset, or it makes your cat go to the bathroom while you're sleeping, then that's why they take action. And that's when they decide for the law to recede, power to be extended.
Absolutely. All right, guys. So I want to thank everybody for joining me. Like I said, just kind of threw this together at the last minute and had a pretty good crowd for something that we just threw together. But just wanted to explore something. Like I said, a lot of this I've already talked about in the kind of edited short form videos that I have on my channel. So if you want to get a more concise explanation kind of prepared, you can check those out. But I just wanted to step in and talk about it because I had seen some misunderstandings around Schmitt, and I wanted to talk about those and then also talk about obviously how this applies to kind of current events here as well. Let me see. Oh, we got another chat here from ILL Films for $10. Thank you very much. There's an argument on the dissident right about reading old books and talking about philosophy of power versus real world action. What are some examples of real world action that you would recommend? And yeah, this is a really old discussion. Unfortunately, it's one that we've talked about a number of times, but I'm happy to mention it here too because it's a good question, right? So in many ways, you're right. At the end of the day, while I think that philosophy is important, I think it does have an impact on things. I think political theory does have a value. Obviously, like I spend a lot of time talking about it on a YouTube channel. At the end of the day, if you stare at any piece of philosophy long enough, it just kind of disappears up its own ass, right? Like at some point it has to get applied to the real world, and some things survive contact with the real world and some don't. That said, examples of real world action are very hard because as the Prudentialist pointed out, we're in a very contentious moment, right? And so what are examples of real world actions? Well, in many ways, as we've talked about, especially kind of on, I guess you could call it the neo-reactionary side. I'm kind of trying to walk away from that term in some ways, but in this sphere, in many ways, we've talked about how direct political action is not a great idea, right? Because for many reasons, one of which you're seeing is that the state doesn't care about your political rights and is more than willing to make up reasons to steal all your money and lock you in prison and destroy your life in a million different ways. There's so many ways that the state can apply pain to you because of its expansive power at this point. And so putting yourself out there and making yourself a target by taking like direct political action is not always the best choice. I'm not saying there's never a point at which something like that isn't useful, but I'm saying that the best thing that in general I have found for most people is unfortunately just in some ways doing the Jordan Peterson thing, right? Get yourself in order, get healthy, get yourself into a place where you have better financial security, where you're more intellectually engaged, where you're more spiritually involved with your church and your community. Put yourself in a position to be the best person you can be and the most useful person you can be in building community, building ties, so that you're prepared for whatever comes and you're in the best position you can be for whatever comes. And so that if you need to be useful, you are someone who has those resources. You have real abilities to impact, and take care of your community if you need to. And I think at this point that tends to be the most useful. Though, of course, if you can do things like secure, a lot of people have used the example of, securing a school board to push CRT out of your locality. If you have the ability to do that, that's also a great use of your time as well. I'm pretty black pilled on national politics, but I think regional politics do still have the ability to impact your local community. And so if you want real world action, it might be best to think about community and local politics rather than thinking about like what big giant protests you can show up to. Though, again, this is not to throw any shade on the truckers for what they're doing. Obviously, I think they're doing something that is in many ways very brave. I just hope it works out for them at the end. But Prudentialist, did you have anything on that you want to add?
Yeah, I would agree with you about the whole national politics thing, or at least here in the US, right, is because Auron and I will tell you, both based on our real life experiences, from whether our own interest in politics or because of the jobs that we've held, local politics is not as sexy or attractive as the national stuff. But local politics, you have more power and you have more influence to maybe sway things. So don't be discouraged if I tell you that, maybe attending a county commissioners meeting about road funding, where they'll be there for 4 hours over a procedure and there's maybe 5 minutes for public comment. You should go to those things, because even though it's not attractive, it's something in which you have your input on, because a lot of local politics doesn't have a lot of actual local attention. And as we've noticed, whether it's either with selectorate theory or what we talked about today, if there's a small group of people that they have to keep happy, and you're going to be one of those people that keeps going out there, then do so. And as I've mentioned on my channel, when's the last time that you broke bread with your neighbors? When's the last time that you decided to, go to a volunteer event with your church? There's been a really good discussion lately on Twitter. I think it was Mog the Urbanite who had said it, and where he talked about, form, emergency response groups. It doesn't have to be political, but if you know how to clear a tree out of the way of the road, perform first aid, and know where to get together or offer shelter to somebody who's in danger of a storm, you're going to be able to weather anything a lot worse as government gets more incompetent or more preferential under certain groups and certain aspects of law. So community helps, because so many people are so deracinated online that they don't know how to have social skills or talk to people. So you do need to have those real world friends and networks. I just spent last weekend with a fellow creator, and we got to hang out and get to know each other a lot better. And that stuff helps, because if you have friends and you have people that have skills that you may not have or can learn from, it'll go a lot farther than, it's like that Wojak meme where it's just like, all right, guys, we've secured our land. We're ready to go. What did you bring with me? And everyone's just like, well, I brought like my 50 copies of my Julius Fola books. And as funny as that is, and Julius Fola is worth reading, it's important to have some real world skills and some real world connections. So it's important for you to understand these things, right? The theory and whatnot, but it's also important to know some of the basics, like changing a tire and knowing how your government operates on your city council meeting.
All right, guys. Well, thanks again for the questions. And of course, thank you, the Prudentialist. Make sure that you're checking out all of his stuff, subscribing to his channel and his Twitter and everything else.
Please do, and I'm streaming tomorrow, roughly around the same time, covering news and taking all of your questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody, for kind of just jumping on at the last minute here. I know this came out of nowhere, but it was great to see you all. I appreciate the questions in the super chat. If you're first time here, I know I saw some people saying, hey, I saw you on Twitter and I saw you're doing this, but I've never been on the YouTube. Make sure you go ahead and subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can find all my other links to like Gab and Odyssey and everything else. If you don't want to use kind of those mainstream platforms, I don't blame you. By all means, feel free to use those alt tech ones. That's always great to have those subscriptions, because you never know when one of us is going to get banned off anything. So thanks everybody so much for showing up. And as always, I'll talk to you next time.